More than 150 armed Wehrmacht soldiers marched through the snow-covered forest behind a 73-year-old woman, completely unaware that each step brought them not toward victory, but toward their final defeat. The column stretched nearly 200 meters between the frozen pines, a serpent of field gray uniforms winding through the winter wilderness. Infantry soldiers trudged forward with rifles slung across their shoulders. Officers barked occasional commands in clipped German. Radio operators bent under the weight of communication equipment strapped to their backs. At the front, leaning heavily on a walking stick and struggling to move her felt-booted feet through the deep snow, walked a bent figure wrapped in a dark headscarf. The Germans believed they had captured the perfect guide, a harmless old woman who would show them any path out of sheer terror. They were catastrophically wrong. February 1942 proved especially brutal in this corner of Kalinin Oblast. The temperature plunged to minus 25 degrees Celsius. Snow cover reached a full meter in depth, transforming the landscape into an endless white expanse broken only by dark sentinels of pine and fir. Visibility in the forest rarely exceeded 50 paces, the dense undergrowth and low-hanging branches creating a labyrinth of shadows even at midday. In these conditions, the German command had decided to launch a deep raid into the Soviet rear. The operation required a local guide, someone who knew every trail and clearing, every ravine and frozen stream. When a patrol discovered an elderly woman in the woods near the village of Kurakino, the officers considered it exceptional luck. Gray hair escaped from beneath her headscarf, wrinkled hands trembled either from cold or from age, and her gaze held what the invaders interpreted as submission and fear. Through a translator, they explained simply, "Lead us around Soviet positions to places where troops do not expect an attack, or we will burn your village to ashes with everyone inside it." The woman, whose name was Nina Gavrilovna Teplova, silently nodded and raised her hand to point eastward. The German soldiers exchanged relieved glances. Of course she would cooperate. 73 years old, barely able to walk, clearly terrified. Such a person would not only refrain from resistance, she would not dare speak a word out of turn. The officer commanding the column ordered 2 submachine gunners detailed to escort the guide. He instructed the rest to maintain distance, preserve silence, and follow single file along whatever trail the old woman broke through the snow. The mission seemed straightforward. March 15 kilometers through the forest, emerge at a railway line behind Soviet units, launch a surprise attack and create chaos in the enemy rear. The column set out at dawn with Nina shuffling ahead, moving slowly and cautiously, stopping periodically as if to rest. The Germans grew irritated at the pace, but understood that an elderly peasant woman simply could not move faster through meter-deep snow. What the German soldiers did not know involved several critical details. First, Nina Gavrilovna Teplova had lived in these woods her entire life and knew every ravine, every clearing, every dangerous section as intimately as she knew her own cottage. Second, her youngest son had died in the first months of war near Smolensk, while her eldest son was listed as missing in action after the battles for Rzhev. Third, and most importantly, a partisan detachment of approximately 80 fighters operated in these forests, and the residents of Kurakino maintained constant communication with them. When the Germans seized Nina near the forest edge that early morning, she had been returning from the partisans. In her woven basket beneath a cloth lay not mushrooms or firewood, but fresh intelligence about German positions that the old woman had been passing to the People's Avengers for 3 consecutive months. The Germans checked the basket superficially, found nothing suspicious, and decided to use their prisoner as a guide. Teplova instantly understood what chance fate had provided her. The route she chose ran through a section of forest the partisans called Wolf's Ravine, a deep gorge with steep slopes covered in dense spruce. The terrain there allowed for a perfect ambush. The enemy could not quickly deploy. Visibility was severely limited. Escape routes were blocked by natural obstacles. Precisely there, partisan commander Vasily Korneev kept the main forces of his detachment in constant combat readiness. The column advanced deeper into the forest. German soldiers walked with rifles at the ready, glancing nervously to either side. Experienced warriors among them sensed something wrong. Too quiet in the forest, too narrow the trail, too thick the undergrowth on both sides. But the officers drove the column forward. The operation schedule was calculated by hours. They could not delay, and the old woman appeared to be leading them correctly eastward toward the designated objective. Nina Teplova counted kilometers to herself as she walked. Each step came with difficulty. Age and cold took their toll. But she did not stop. Her hands truly trembled, her breathing grew labored, her feet slipped on iced stones hidden beneath the snow. The Germans saw a feeble old woman and never suspected that behind this outward weakness lay the iron will of someone who had already made her decision and would not deviate from it. After 2 hours of marching, the column approached a fork in the trails. An officer pointed to the right path, wider and more convenient. Teplova shook her head and indicated the left trail, narrow and winding between the trees, descending into a ravine. The translator conveyed the question, "Why not take that road? It is clearly easier." The old woman explained with gestures, "Soviet patrols will spot you immediately on that path. But this trail is secret, used by local hunters. It will lead you exactly where you need to go." The Germans conferred for 5 minutes. The column commander studied his map, checked his compass, looked at the sky to judge the time. Finally, he waved his hand dismissively and ordered them to follow the old woman. The soldiers moved down the narrow trail deeper into the forest, toward the place where, between snow-covered slopes, a partisan ambush already waited for them. The path grew increasingly narrow, the slopes on either side steeper, the trees overhead closing so densely that even daylight struggled to penetrate. The column stretched out even more. Soldiers walked practically in single file, cursing under their breath about the impassability of the Russian forest. Officers demanded silence, but could not completely suppress the grumbling of infantrymen who had grown tired from the march, frozen in the bitter cold, and most importantly, begun to doubt the correctness of the chosen route. They had already covered more than half the distance, committed to this course with no easy way to turn back. What they could not see, what they could not possibly know, was that high above them on both slopes, concealed among the dark spruce branches, partisan fighters lay waiting in absolute silence, with weapons trained on the narrow trail below. The operation that German command had been planning held strategic significance for the entire sector of the front. In February 1942, the defensive line in Kalinin Oblast had stabilized after the winter offensive of the Red Army, but remained vulnerable to flanking attacks. German intelligence had discovered that Soviet forces concentrated their main strength along fortified positions beside the roads, leaving forested sections under control of small patrols and partisan detachments. The concept involved conducting a reinforced diversionary group through these weakly defended areas, emerging at a railway junction and disrupting the supply lines of Soviet units. The regiment from which the column had been formed was stationed 25 kilometers to the west and received orders to prepare 150 of their best fighters for the raid. The group's composition included infantrymen with experience of combat operations on the Eastern Front, sappers for demolishing rail lines, signalmen for coordination with main forces, and 3 officers, one of whom spoke Russian. The weapons had been selected carefully: Mauser 98 rifles, MG-34 machine guns, grenades, detonators, dry rations sufficient for 3 days. The plan appeared flawless on paper. Departure to the designated area under cover of darkness, rapid march, a strike through the forest with a guide, attack at dawn the following day, and withdrawal along a pre-scouted route. German staff officers calculated the timing, accounted for possible delays, and provided backup options. The only thing they failed to account for was the possibility that a 73-year-old peasant woman would prove not a frightened victim, but a conscious participant in the resistance. Nina Teplova continued leading the column deeper into the ravine. The trail wound between ancient pines, periodically disappearing under snowdrifts, then reappearing as a narrow track barely wide enough for one person. The Germans nervously fingered their rifle straps, breathing heavily in the freezing air, watching the old woman's back as she shuffled forward with maddening slowness. Each stop accompanied by irritated shouts in broken Russian. The woman would silently nod, catch her breath, and continue onward. What the German soldiers did not know lay in several critical details that would determine their fate within the next few hours. The trail she had chosen deliberately avoided all the easier routes, all the wider paths that would have allowed the column to move more quickly toward their objective. Instead, she led them along hunters' tracks, through the densest parts of the forest, where spruce branches hung so low they brushed against helmets and caught on equipment. The snow here lay deeper than anywhere else, forcing the soldiers to lift their boots high with each step, exhausting them far more rapidly than a march along open ground. Every kilometer they advanced took them farther from any possibility of reinforcement, farther from the clear sight lines where German tactical superiority might prevail, deeper into terrain where every advantage belonged to those who knew it intimately. Nina counted the distance in her mind, converting the familiar landmarks into rough measurements. There, the lightning-struck oak marked 3 kilometers from the village. There, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear meant they had covered 5 kilometers. The clearing where mushrooms grew thick in autumn signified 7 kilometers traveled. Her body genuinely suffered from the cold and exertion. At 73 years of age, with joints stiffened by decades of hard peasant labor, every step brought real pain. Her lungs burned with each breath of air, cold enough to freeze moisture in her nostrils. The stick she leaned upon was not theatrical prop, but absolute necessity. Yet none of this physical distress diminished her determination. She had made her decision the moment the Germans threatened her village, the moment they placed her between collaboration and destruction. There had never truly been any choice at all. Behind her trudged men who believed themselves conquerors, soldiers of a military machine that had swept across Europe, subjugating nation after nation with methodical efficiency. They wore field gray uniforms that had marched through Poland and France, boots that had crushed the streets of a dozen captured cities. They carried weapons that had brought kingdoms to their knees. Yet here, in this frozen Russian forest, all their technical prowess, all their tactical training, all their modern equipment meant progressively less with each meter they descended into the ravine. The officers consulted their maps repeatedly, trying to match the terrain to the markings on paper. The maps showed the general contours of the land, but could not capture the reality of this labyrinth of trees and slopes. Could not convey how the forest closed around them like a trap gradually contracting. The path narrowed further still. Soldiers who had been walking 2 abreast now moved in single file. The column stretched out over an even greater distance, gaps opening between groups as men struggled through particularly difficult sections. Communication became more challenging. An order shouted from the front took minutes to reach the rear. The cohesion that had characterized the column at the start of the march began to fray. Officers barked commands to maintain spacing and silence, but the forest itself seemed to swallow their words. Some of the more experienced soldiers, veterans of the winter fighting around Moscow, felt growing unease. They had learned to recognize danger in the silence of Russian woods. This forest was too quiet. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. Just the crunch of boots in snow, the harsh breathing of exhausted men, and the occasional whispered curse. The ravine deepened. What had been gentle slopes became steep walls rising on either side of the trail. Dense stands of spruce clung to these slopes, their dark branches creating shadows even in the pale February daylight. Visibility, already poor in the forest, now shrank to mere meters ahead and behind. The Germans could see only the man directly in front of them and the man directly behind. Everything else disappeared into a gray-green twilight of trees and snow. The temperature seemed to drop further as they descended. Cold air pooled in the bottom of the ravine, seeping through uniforms despite their layers. Soldiers tucked their chins deeper into coat collars, pulled caps lower over ears, but could not escape the penetrating chill. Fingers grew numb inside gloves. Toes lost sensation inside boots. The cold became another enemy, sapping strength and will as effectively as any bullet. Nina Teplova knew this ravine as intimately as she knew the rooms of her cottage. Every twist in the trail, every treacherous patch of ice concealed beneath innocent-looking snow. Every spot where the slope became steep enough to send a man tumbling if he lost his footing. She had walked this path in spring when wildflowers carpeted the forest floor. In summer, when the air hung thick with the scent of pine resin. In autumn, when leaves turned gold and red before falling. And she had walked it in winter, tracking rabbits and foxes, gathering firewood, following the old ways her father had taught her and his father before him. The Germans saw an obstacle course. She saw home. They stumbled where she stepped confidently. They struggled where she moved with economy of motion born from 7 decades of experience. The place the partisans called Wolf's Ravine represented everything German military doctrine warned against. A deep gorge carved by centuries of spring floods, its slopes rose at angles that made climbing difficult even without enemy fire. Dense spruce covered every surface, branches interlocking overhead to create perpetual twilight even at midday. The terrain offered no room for maneuver, no space to deploy forces effectively, no possibility of bringing superior numbers to bear. For an ambush, it was perfection itself. Partisan commander Vasily Korneev had recognized this immediately upon first surveying the area months earlier. He had positioned his fighters here specifically for moments like this one, when opportunity and necessity aligned. The partisan detachment numbered approximately 80 fighters, a mix that reflected the desperate circumstances of war in occupied territory. Former Red Army soldiers who had escaped encirclement brought military discipline and tactical knowledge. Local hunters contributed intimate understanding of the forest and expert marksmanship developed through years of tracking game. Young men who had fled, forced labor conscription, provided determination born of having nothing left to lose. A handful of women served as scouts and nurses. Their ability to move through occupied villages without arousing immediate suspicion proving invaluable for gathering intelligence. Together, they had transformed this section of wilderness into a fortress without walls, a killing ground that appeared to German eyes as nothing more than impassable forest. Their weapons told the story of partisan warfare in stark terms. A few had genuine military rifles, Mosin Nagants carefully maintained and jealously guarded. Most carried whatever they had managed to scavenge from battlefields or ambush sites. German Mausers, damaged Soviet submachine guns repaired with improvised parts, even old hunting rifles that had hung over cottage mantels before the war. 2 captured MG-34 machine guns represented their heaviest firepower. positioned now on opposite slopes to create crossfire. Ammunition remained chronically scarce, which meant every shot had to count, every bullet carefully conserved for moments when it would achieve maximum effect. They had learned through brutal experience that partisan survival depended on making the enemy pay such a terrible price that German commanders would think twice before venturing into certain areas. Korneve himself had been a history teacher before the invasion, a quiet man who spent his evenings reading about ancient battles and his days trying to convince bored students that the past mattered. War had revealed capabilities he never knew he possessed. The same analytical mind that once dissected Napoleonic campaigns now planned ambushes with deadly precision. The patience required to guide adolescents through difficult concepts translated into the ability to wait hours in freezing cold for the perfect moment to strike. His knowledge of human nature, developed through years of managing classroom dynamics, helped him understand how soldiers under stress would react, what mistakes exhausted men would make. He had transformed himself from educator into warrior, not through any desire for violence, but through recognition that some things demanded resistance, regardless of personal cost. When Vasily, Nina Teplova's son, had arrived at the partisan camp in the hours before dawn, Korneve had listened to his breathless report with growing excitement mixed with dread. 150 German soldiers represented both enormous danger and unprecedented opportunity. If the ambush succeeded, they would capture more weapons and equipment than they had taken in all previous operations combined. If it failed, if somehow the Germans detected the trap had been brought their full force to bear, the partisan detachment might be annihilated. Everything depended on terrain, timing, and the iron nerve of an old woman leading enemy soldiers to their doom. Korneve had made his decision in seconds. They would prepare the ambush at Wolf's Ravine and trust Nina Teplova to deliver the enemy into their hands. The fighters had moved into position before first light, climbing the slopes in darkness, finding their assigned spots through familiarity rather than sight. Each man knew exactly where to go, had rehearsed this scenario during endless planning sessions in their forest camp. They dug shallow scrapes in the snow for concealment, arranged fallen branches to break up their silhouettes, settled in to wait with the patience hunters develop. The cold became another enemy to endure. Men stamped their feet carefully to maintain circulation without making noise, flexed fingers inside gloves to keep them nimble enough to pull triggers. They ate snow to quench thirst without moving from positions. Some whispered prayers. Others stared into the middle distance, thinking of homes destroyed, families lost, reasons for being here in this frozen forest, preparing to kill or be killed. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, though its light barely penetrated the dense canopy. Korneve moved silently along the line, checking positions, offering quiet words of encouragement, reminding his fighters to hold fire until his signal. Discipline would determine success or failure. If even one man fired too early, if panic or eagerness caused someone to break before the entire German column entered the killing zone, the ambush would fail. The Germans would scatter, take cover, bring their training and superior numbers into play. But if the partisans waited, if they allowed every enemy soldier to commit fully to the narrow trail at the bottom of the ravine, they could achieve something remarkable. The youngest fighters showed the most nervousness, hands trembling slightly as they gripped weapons. Veterans of previous ambushes displayed eerie calm, conserving energy for the violence to come. Then scouts passed word down the line. The column approached. German voices could be heard faintly through the trees. Orders barked in that harsh language that had become synonymous with occupation and death. The partisan positions fell absolutely silent. Men who had been shifting slightly to ease cramped muscles now froze motionless as hunting cats. Fingers moved to rest beside triggers, waiting for the command that would unleash controlled chaos. Through gaps in the undergrowth, they could see movement below. Field gray uniforms appeared and disappeared between trees as the column wound its way deeper into the ravine. At the front, barely visible, walked the bent figure of an old woman in a dark headscarf, moving with painful slowness, leading more than 100 armed men toward their appointment with destiny. The entire column had committed itself to the ravine, stretched along 200 meters of narrow trail with soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder in places where the path constricted between rocks and fallen timber. Nina stopped on a small clearing where the track widened slightly, just enough for several men to stand abreast. She turned slowly to face the German officer who had been following close behind her throughout the march. For the first time since her capture, she spoke clearly in Russian, her voice carrying no trace of fear or hesitation. She said simply, "We have arrived." The officer frowned, not understanding her words, gesturing impatiently for the translator. Before the translator could respond, Nina raised her right hand high above her head in a deliberate, unmistakable signal. That gesture transformed everything in an instant. Commander Kornev saw the signal through a gap in the spruce branches. His heart hammered against his ribs as he raised his own hand, every muscle in his body coiled with tension that had been building for hours. He brought his hand down in a chopping motion and shouted the single word that would unleash carefully controlled violence. Fire. The winter silence shattered like glass struck by a hammer. From both slopes of the ravine, 80 partisan weapons spoke simultaneously in a deafening crescendo. The two captured MG-34 machine guns opened up first, their mechanical chattering rising above all other sounds, tracers cutting bright lines through the dim forest light. Rifle fire followed instantly, disciplined volleys from men who had been waiting so long their fingers ached from cold and anticipation. The Germans never had a chance to react properly. The first seconds proved absolutely catastrophic for the column. Men fell before they understood they were under attack, before training could override the shock of sudden ambush. The tight spacing that had seemed necessary for maintaining cohesion in the narrow ravine now became a death sentence. Bullets that missed their primary targets found secondary victims standing directly behind. The Germans tried to scatter, but had nowhere to go. The trail offered no cover, the slopes too steep for rapid climbing, the undergrowth too dense to penetrate quickly. Those who attempted to return fire aimed at muzzle flashes high above them, but could not see actual targets among the trees. Their bullets smashed into tree trunks, sent bark flying, accomplished nothing against enemies concealed in prepared positions. The submachine gunner beside Nina recovered from his initial shock, swinging his weapon toward the old woman who had betrayed them. His face contorted with rage, and understanding arrived too late. He pulled the trigger, holding it down, the burst stitching across her chest at point-blank range. Nina felt the impacts as distant things, as though happening to someone else's body. She remained standing for perhaps 3 heartbeats, long enough to meet the German's eyes with a gaze that held neither fear nor hatred, but something like satisfaction. Then her legs folded, and she collapsed into the snow that was already staining red with blood from dozens of wounds. Her last conscious thought was of her sons, a hope that she might see them again in whatever came after this world ended. The battle descended into pure chaos, measured in screaming seconds. German officers shouted contradictory orders that could barely be heard over the gunfire. Some commanded their men to charge up the slopes, to close with the enemy and negate the advantage of high ground. Others ordered retreat, a fighting withdrawal back along the trail. A few attempted to establish defensive positions using whatever natural cover existed. The lack of unified response doomed them all. Small groups that tried rushing the slopes were cut down before climbing more than a few meters. The machine guns traversed back and forth methodically, gunners working their weapons with brutal efficiency. Men who sought to retreat found the trail behind them equally exposed, equally deadly. Every direction offered only different paths to the same outcome. The Germans who survived the first minute of fire dropped flat and sought any depression in the ground, any boulder or fallen log that might provide protection. They returned fire more effectively now, veteran soldiers falling back on training despite terror and confusion. Several partisans cried out as German bullets found them, wounded men struggling to maintain their positions. But the fundamental equation of the ambush remained unchanged. The partisans occupied superior ground with prepared positions and clear fields of fire. The Germans lay exposed in a narrow killing zone with limited visibility and no room to maneuver. Military mathematics dictated only one possible result. The volume of fire from the slopes never slackened. Kornilov moved along his line, encouraging his fighters, directing fire toward concentrations of enemy troops, ensuring no German got the chance to organize effective resistance. Minutes stretched like hours for the men trapped at the bottom of Wolf's Ravine. The air filled with smoke from discharged weapons, the acrid smell mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp odor of fear sweat. Wounded Germans screamed for medics who could not reach them, called for mothers and wives and God in desperate voices that cut through the continuous roar of battle. The snow that had been pristine white now showed crimson patches spreading and merging. Bodies lay crumpled in positions that no living person could maintain. Weapons fallen from nerveless hands, eyes staring at nothing. Some wounded men tried crawling toward imagined safety, leaving trails through the snow like wounded animals seeking dens that did not exist. After 20 minutes of sustained combat, German resistance effectively collapsed. The surviving enemy soldiers, perhaps 30 men from the original 150, raised hands in surrender or simply lay motionless, hoping to be overlooked. Kornilov ordered his fighters to cease fire. The sudden absence of gunfire leaving ears ringing in an eerie quiet, broken only by the moans of wounded and the drip of blood, melting snow. Partisans descended cautiously from their positions, weapons ready, checking each fallen German to ensure no threat remained. They found all 3 officers dead, killed in the initial volley. Most of the experienced soldiers had died fighting. The survivors were primarily younger troops, boys conscripted into a war they barely understood, now staring with hollow eyes at the hell their morning had become. The partisan fighters moved methodically through the aftermath, their faces grim as they processed what they had accomplished and what it had cost. Commander Kornilov stood near the center of the ravine, surveying the scene with the analytical eye of a former teacher assessing examination results. Except these results were measured in corpses and captured equipment. The operation had succeeded beyond even his most optimistic projections. More than 100 German soldiers lay dead or dying at the bottom of Wolf's Ravine. Another 20 wounded prisoners sat under guard, hands clasped behind their heads, still stunned by the speed of their destruction. The remainder had surrendered without further resistance once they realized the hopelessness of their situation. The partisan casualties numbered only 3 wounded, none critically. One man had taken a ricochet to the shoulder, another suffered a leg wound when a German bullet struck the tree trunk he was hiding behind and sent wooden splinters flying. The third had been grazed across the ribs, a bloody furrow that looked worse than it actually was. Their partisan comrades bandaged them quickly with captured German medical supplies, better quality than anything they had possessed before. The disparity in losses spoke to the perfection of the ambush, the advantage of prepared positions, and the deadly effectiveness of surprise applied with ruthless precision. The Germans had walked into a trap from which escape proved impossible. The trove of captured equipment exceeded anything the partisan detachment had taken in all previous operations combined. The fighters collected weapons with barely suppressed excitement, handling the prizes with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. More than 150 Mauser rifles, many still warm from recent firing. 4 MG-34 machine guns, 3 undamaged, and 1 with a cracked stock that could be repaired. Dozens of pistols, hundreds of stick grenades, boxes of ammunition that would keep the detachment supplied for months. The sappers' equipment proved particularly valuable. Explosives, detonators, wire, tools that would make future railway sabotage operations far more effective. A German radio set intact and functional opened possibilities for monitoring enemy communications. Beyond weaponry, the practical necessities of survival drew equal attention. Winter uniforms, heavy wool greatcoats still bearing the warmth of their previous owners, represented salvation from the killing cold that claimed as many partisan lives as German bullets. Boots in various sizes, some stained with blood but otherwise serviceable. Blankets, mess kits, canteens, all the mundane items that meant the difference between survival and death in the frozen forest. Food supplies from the German packs, dark bread, canned meat, chocolate, even cigarettes. Luxuries that partisans had not seen in months. The fighters divided everything according to need rather than rank. A discipline Korneve had instilled through example rather than command. Korneve found Nina Teplova where she had fallen, lying on her back with arms outstretched as though embracing the gray February sky. Snow had already begun covering her body, nature providing a gentle shroud. Her face showed no pain, no regret, only a profound peace that struck Korneve as remarkable, given the violent manner of her death. He knelt beside her, removing his cap despite the cold, and remained there in silence for several heartbeats. Other partisans gathered around, forming a rough circle, each man lost in his own thoughts about courage and sacrifice. Someone whispered a prayer. Another made the sign of the cross. Most simply stood bearing witness to what one old woman had accomplished through will alone. The commander understood they could not remain here long. German forces would eventually investigate when their column failed to report. Staying near the ambush site invited counterattack by a force the partisans could not hope to defeat in open battle. He issued orders with quiet authority born of necessity rather than desire for command. Collect all usable equipment and distribute it among the fighters. Each man would carry what he could manage along with his own gear, destroy anything that could not be transported, render it useless to the enemy. Search the German dead for documents, maps, anything that might provide intelligence value. Gather the wounded prisoners and prepare them for movement. Execute anyone too severely injured to walk, as brutal practicality demanded. They could not afford to leave witnesses who might reveal partisan positions. Several fighters worked to obscure their tracks, using branches to sweep snow over bloodstains and boot prints, though they knew fresh snowfall would do more to conceal evidence than any human effort. Others rigged simple traps along the approaches to the ravine, grenades connected to tripwires that might slow any German pursuit or at least announce it with explosive warnings. The partisan detachment understood woodscraft that regular soldiers rarely possessed. They moved through forest like smoke through air, leaving minimal traces, reading terrain with instincts developed through necessity and survival. Within 2 hours of the battle's end, they had collected everything of value and prepared to withdraw. The march back to their forest camp proceeded with careful discipline. They moved in dispersed formation rather than tight column, spread across a wide front so that a single ambush could not destroy the entire force. Scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks, watching for any sign of German patrols. The wounded walked, supported by comrades. German prisoners stumbled along under guard, everyone understanding that falling behind meant death in these merciless woods. The fresh snow that had seemed like an enemy during the ambush now became an ally, covering their tracks, muffling sounds, providing the concealment that partisan survival required. They reached their camp as afternoon shadows lengthened into early evening. The base consisted of dugouts and lean-tos scattered across several acres of dense forest, camouflaged so thoroughly that a person could walk within meters and see nothing suspicious. Sentries challenged them with coded phrases before allowing passage. The returning fighters received subdued congratulations rather than celebrations, as veterans understood that today's victory might inspire tomorrow's German reprisal. They stored the captured weapons in hidden caches, distributed the food and equipment, tended to their wounded with supplies that for once proved adequate to the task. Korneve sat in his crude command post, a dugout lined with logs and covered with earth and branches, and composed his report by candlelight. He wrote in careful detail about the operation, the role Nina Teplova had played, the losses inflicted on the enemy, the equipment captured. His handwriting remained neat, despite cold, stiffened fingers, the teacher's habit of legibility persisting even in these circumstances. The report would travel by courier through partisan networks until it reached Soviet command, there to be filed among thousands of similar accounts of small victories that collectively undermined German occupation. He gave particular emphasis to Nina's sacrifice, knowing that martyrs served purposes beyond their immediate tactical contributions. The story of the ambush spread through occupied villages with remarkable speed, passing from mouth to mouth in whispered conversations, growing slightly with each retelling, as such stories do. A 73-year-old woman had led more than 100 German soldiers into a partisan trap, sacrificing herself to deliver vengeance for her fallen sons and occupied homeland. The tale provided hope to people living under brutal occupation, proof that resistance remained possible even for the seemingly powerless. It inspired others to take small actions against the invaders, to pass information to partisans, to sabotage in subtle ways, to maintain the spirit of defiance that occupation sought to crush. The partisan detachment buried Nina Gavrilovna Teplova in the forest she had known throughout her entire life, choosing a site on a slight rise where birch trees grew among the pines. They dug through frozen earth with difficulty, taking turns with shovels and improvised tools, working until they had created a grave deep enough to protect her remains from scavengers. The ceremony held a solemnity that transcended religious or political doctrine, becoming instead a fundamental human acknowledgement of sacrifice and loss. Korneve spoke briefly about her courage, her determination, her unwavering commitment to liberation. He avoided grandiose rhetoric, letting simple facts speak their own truth about what she had accomplished. The fighters fashioned a crude wooden cross from birch branches, binding them together with wire salvaged from German equipment. Someone carved her name and the date into the horizontal beam using a knife point, working carefully to ensure the letters would remain legible. They placed wildflowers preserved from autumn between pages of a book, small touches of beauty in this place of death. Then the partisan detachment formed up in ragged ranks and fired a volley from captured German rifles into the gray sky, the shots echoing through the forest like thunder. It represented the highest honor they could offer, this salute from weapons taken from the enemy she had helped them destroy. Several men wept openly, feeling no shame in tears shed for such a woman. Word of the operation reached Soviet command within 2 weeks, carried by couriers who moved through partisan networks with practiced efficiency. The report traveled from forest camp to contact point to clandestine meeting, each handler adding their authentication before passing it forward. Eventually, it arrived at headquarters, where officers studied such accounts to assess partisan effectiveness and plan coordinated operations. The scale of the ambush caught immediate attention, 150 enemy casualties inflicted by a single partisan detachment represented significant tactical success. But the method of achieving that success, the role of an elderly civilian volunteer, elevated the incident beyond mere military statistics into something approaching legend. The bureaucratic machinery of recognition moved slowly even during wartime, hindered by poor communications and the overwhelming volume of heroic actions requiring documentation. Korneev's recommendation that Nina Teplova receive posthumous honors sat in various offices for months, while more immediate military crises demanded attention. But eventually, as summer arrived and the front lines shifted, someone with authority reviewed the case and agreed that such sacrifice deserved formal acknowledgement. In July 1942, official orders designated Nina Gavrilovna Teplova as recipient of the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class, one of the highest decorations established for those fighting the fascist invasion. Later, she would receive the Medal for Partisan of the Patriotic War, First Class, confirming her status among those who had resisted occupation. The awards themselves, physical medals struck in metal and attached to ribbons, were delivered to her daughter Anna when Soviet forces finally liberated the region. Anna had survived the occupation through a combination of luck and caution, keeping her head down while German authority ruled, never revealing her connection to partisan activities. She accepted the medals with trembling hands, holding them as though they were fragments of her mother's soul made tangible. The official who presented them spoke formal words about sacrifice and patriotism. But Anna barely heard, lost in memories of the woman who had raised her, taught her to sew and cook and endure, the woman who had chosen death over submission. The village of Kurakino ceased to exist in any meaningful sense by the time liberation came. German forces, enraged by partisan activity in the area and following their doctrine of collective punishment, had burned most structures before retreating westward. Blackened chimneys stood like grave markers among the ruins. Foundations filled with snow marked where homes had sheltered families for generations. The cottage where Nina Teplova had lived her entire life existed only as charred timbers and memories. Survivors returned to find devastation, yet they returned nonetheless, driven by attachment to land and place that transcended physical destruction. They began rebuilding immediately, clearing rubble, salvaging what could be salvaged, planting seeds for future harvests. After the war ended, authorities erected a memorial at Wolf's Ravine where the ambush had occurred. A simple stone monument, gray granite shaped into an obelisk, bearing an inscription that honored the partisan fighters and specifically named Nina Gavrilovna Teplova. The text described her act in spare language that nevertheless conveyed its significance. Here, a patriot led the enemy into ambush, sacrificing herself for liberation. Students from regional schools came on organized visits, learning about resistance and courage through this specific example. Veterans of the partisan movement, those who had survived the forest years, gathered there on anniversaries to remember fallen comrades and the civilians who had supported them at terrible risk. Vasily Korneev emerged from the war with the rank of major, having commanded increasingly larger partisan formations as the tide turned against German forces. He participated in the liberation of his home region, working alongside regular Red Army units, providing intelligence and guidance through terrain he knew intimately. After victory, he returned to his true calling as an educator, taking a position teaching history at a regional pedagogical institute. His wartime experiences informed his lectures, though he spoke rarely of personal exploits, preferring to discuss broader patterns and consequences. He wrote several books about partisan operations, academic works based on careful research and first-hand knowledge. In each volume, he dedicated substantial sections to Nina Teplova's sacrifice, ensuring her story would not fade into obscurity. The narrative of the 73-year-old peasant woman who destroyed an entire German column became embedded in regional memory, then national consciousness. Newspapers published accounts during and after the war. Radio programs dramatized the incident for audiences hungry for stories of resistance and triumph. Poets composed verses celebrating her courage. Artists created paintings showing the moment of her signal, romantic interpretations that emphasized heroism over horror. School textbooks included brief summaries alongside other partisan accomplishments. She entered the pantheon of Soviet heroes, her name mentioned alongside Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya and other martyrs who had defied occupation. A small museum dedicated to partisan activity opened in the regional capital during the 1950s. One room focused specifically on Nina Teplova, displaying her photograph from before the war, official documents regarding her awards, a map showing the ambush location, testimonies from surviving partisans who had witnessed her final act. Visitors moved through quietly, studying the exhibits, trying to comprehend the mindset of someone who could walk knowingly toward death for a cause larger than self. Her daughter Anna visited occasionally, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ensuring family memory aligned with public commemoration. She would stand before her mother's photograph, seeing the young woman Nina had been rather than the old woman who had died, remembering stories and lessons that shaped her own understanding of duty and sacrifice. The deeper meaning of Nina Teplova's action transcended military significance or propaganda value. Her story represented the capacity of ordinary people to perform extraordinary acts when circumstances demand. She possessed no special training, held no rank, commanded no authority beyond moral conviction. Yet when presented with a choice between passive collaboration and active resistance, she chose resistance, knowing the price. That choice, replicated thousands of times by thousands of individuals across occupied territory, formed the foundation of partisan effectiveness. The Germans could not crush a movement sustained by population-wide commitment to liberation, could not garrison every village or patrol every forest path, or prevent every act of sabotage when even elderly peasant women became potential threats to their occupation.